So the introduction is a place where you can convince your readers that you know why your work is useful and also why it's useful for them. So you're really able to take the general context of a field and narrow it down into a certain description of your study. So it provides a context for why what you did is so important. You can see here, for example, this lists the importance of the study, why it was important, and why is it important for what you're investigating. Make sure that you do not mix the introduction, results, discussion, and conclusion. These are all very separate sections of the manuscript. But it's also important to understand the limitations of the study. So the introduction is really, why did you do what you did, and what do you hope to accomplish? The methods are really the cookbook of the study. It includes all the important details so that others can reproduce the work. Make sure you do things such as give the vendor names for certain drugs or different chemicals or different pieces of equipment that were used. Make sure you identify all chemicals that were used. And don't use proprietary, unidentifiable compounds without a clear description. Make sure you present properly controlled experiments. You avoid adding comments and discussion, and write in the past tense. So a certain chemical was added to a certain cell line. You also may want to consider the use of supplementary material, which is a place to put more detailed descriptions that don't have to be within the body of the main manuscript. So ethics committee approval is very important. Some of the best studies are still excellent studies, but if they didn't receive ethical approval, they won't be able to be published. So experiments on humans and animals must follow applicable ethics standards that are really governed by the institute where the project is performed. Approval is required and should be specified in the manuscript of who approved the study. Editors, of course, can make their own decisions as to whether the experiments were done in an ethically acceptable manner. Sometimes, unfortunately, local ethics laws are below internationally accepted standards, so those manuscripts may be kicked back to the author. So the results really tell a clear picture of what you found. How did what you did in your study, how is that going to add to the body of literature? Also, how is this new novel and does it advance the field? So you really should include the main findings. You don't have to include every single finding that was discussed. These can be part of the supplementary material. But these should really follow the outline that was presented in the methods. So highlight the findings that differ from findings shown in previous work. And discuss the limitations. It's very important to discuss what potential limitations exist in your work, because every study has limitations. But it's also important to talk about the results of the statistical analysis. So make sure that these can be appreciated by someone who's not an expert in statistics. So the figures and tables are the illustrations of the study and are really critical for understanding the importance of the study. They're the most effective way to present the results in figures and tables. And these are the driving force, of course, for publication, is how were the results that were obtained new and novel. The captions for each of the figures must be specific and detailed and include enough information for those studies to be replicated. And make sure you don't duplicate what is contained in the results section in text with figures. Once again, appearance counts. So each photograph should have a scale marker of professional quality in the corner so that you can appreciate the study based on scale. Make sure that the figures and text in the photos is in English and not in French, German, Chinese, Korean, etc. Make sure that plots are not overcrowded. It's also important that only use color when absolutely necessary. So most quantitative data, you don't need to use color. But if you're showing a certain type of data that really requires color, then it's okay to use. But it must be visible and distinguishable when printed in black and white. So make sure that you don't use blue when it's on a black background, etc. And also, stay away from long, boring tables. So the discussion section of your article is where you sell your data. It's how did you do what you did and why is it so important? What did you find in this study? And it, of course, should correlate with the results. But make sure you don't repeat the results. Put your results into perspective with previously published work. So other work may have done the beginning stages of a certain study. So it's good to include that data, but it's also good to include data that contradicts what you're finding. And this really will allow you to describe the limitations and how what you did is so important. So make sure to check for the following. How do your results relate to the original question or objective that was used to study? Have you provided interpretation for each of your results? And are the results consistent with what other investigators have found? If they're not, make sure you've described why. And this is perfectly acceptable because there's always limitations in a study. And so you make sure that you appreciate what limitations exist within your study. And does the discussion logically lead to the conclusion? Is the conclusion that you have come up with, is it really new in the field? So don't make statements that go beyond what the results can support. So it's very easy to say that you've cured a certain disease, but it's unlikely with one study that you've determined how to cure a disease. And make sure that you suddenly don't introduce new terms or ideas into the discussion. So the conclusions present a global and specific conclusion. And it indicates the uses, if appropriate, for the study, and allows you to suggest future experiments and when to indicate that they're being performed. Don't use the conclusion section, which is usually only a few sentences, to summarize the entire paper, but it's really a global summary of the entire work. And also, make sure that you avoid bold judgment statements about impact of your work. Once again, you don't want to say that you've cured a certain disease, but you can say that this study has presented a new way of thinking about how something occurs. Avoid non-quantitative words such as larger, smaller, higher, low, extreme, dramatic. It's really hard to appreciate what these actually mean. So make sure that you use quantitative descriptions when describing your work. So with references, make sure you get them right. Make sure that spelling is included for all authors and it's appropriate, that punctuation is used. Make sure that you're following the guide to authors, which will list how to reference your work. And don't inflate the manuscript with too many references. Make sure that you're only including references that are specific and are used within the study. So only cite the main scientific publications on which your work is based. If possible, avoid listing unpublished observations, personal communications, etc. If you do list these, an editor may ask for documentation. And also make sure to avoid self-citations. It always looks bad when an article contains numerous citations to the author's previous work. 30 to 40 references are the most appropriate number for a full-text article. So supplementary material is really the material that adds to what is presented within the manuscript and gives you a lot more detail, if you will. It also is data that does not fit into the main body of the work. It may be audio or video files. It's not usually part of the printed article, but is available online. But remember that it must relate to and support the data that's presented in the article. Don't use this section to simply add a bunch of data that you have collected. So it really needs to relate to the specific study. So the typical length of a full article or original article, which is not the same for all journals, but is predominantly between 25 and 30 pages of essential data only. So title page, the abstract is 1 paragraph. The introduction is 1.5 to 2 manuscript pages double-spaced. The methods between 2 and 4 pages. The results and discussion between 10 and 12 pages. The conclusions between 1 and 2 pages. And then the figures between 6 and 8, 1 to 3 tables, and 30 to 40 references. The letters or short communications are much smaller and will usually be around 3,000 words or less with 5 figures or less. Make sure to be particular about language, be it UK or US spelling. Make sure you're consistent. And also style. Be clear, concise, objective, and brief. It's also very important to use editing sources in order to make sure that you're consistent with your style. Abbreviations must be defined on the first use. Also, they must be defined in the abstract as well as the main text. Some journals do not allow you to use abbreviations in the abstract. Abbreviations that are firmly established, such as DNA or RNA, do not need to be described because most people know what they mean. But avoid acronyms if possible. Never define an abbreviation of a term that is only used once. You can simply include the whole term and then move on. So the cover letter when you're submitting is really your chance to speak directly to the editor and describe why this is so important. It's really your job application letter. It's telling why this work is so exciting and really needs to be published in this journal. And it's okay to suggest reviewers because that will help the editor to determine who should review the work. But it's also good to mention and explain any conflicts of interest. So do everything to make your submission a success. Remember, no one gets it right the first time. So write, and write is the best way to do it. So after writing a first version, it's good to take a few days, then to come back to the work and to reread and refresh your view of the work. Ask your colleagues and your supervisors to review your manuscript and ask them to be critical and to really be open to their suggestions. So when you're suggesting potential reviewers, you can suggest between 3 and 6, and these really should be authors in your subject area. So it's good to look at what references you're listing, and you can include those authors as potential reviewers. Make sure you don't include collaborators or friends. So the best reviewers tend to view themselves as teachers rather than critics. So the goal is to improve the work published, not to simply tell what's wrong with it. So this figure provides an overview of the peer review process. So initially, the author submits a paper. It's then sent out